This is the story of a man named Stanley.
And this is the story of a man named the narrator. Welcome to the Stanley Parable, a video game that truly broke down the concept of traditional storytelling and the medium upon which it's delivered. It is a game that explores a multitude of topics: free will, choice, but most importantly, the idea of the author and the art and the audience. It questions what these roles do and whether or not they must play the roles they are given. The Stanley Parable provides the situation: a man named Stanley who one day finds everyone in his office missing, whom you have been thrusted control over. You are provided the ability to walk around the space as the narrator explains the next steps in the story, narrating your movements. However, you don't have to listen to the narrator. In fact, this game anticipates it. This is what creates the formula for the Stanley Parable: the freedom of movement and your own choice as the narrator laments over the many steps you take to ruin his story. The game heralds this idea of free will, this ability to express what you would like. You can listen to the narrator drone on and on about how he feels about the critics of his precious game, or can skip and cut him off. However, this pure ability to destroy what the narrator wants to express creates some food for thought. To listen to the narrator is to undermine the very idea of free will that the story he created is about. If you follow each of the steps, you find out that your boss has been mind controlling you and your coworkers and can turn it all off to finally live a life free, made by your own choices. The great irony of this is that you didn't make these choices yourself. The narrator told you what to do. This very concept is embedded deeply within the Stanley Parable structure, but lies beyond free will lies the push and pull of art and its interpretation. Throughout the Stanley Parable, we know that the narrator has a story he wants to follow, but furthermore, we know that he has an intended meaning and reaction to follow the story. In terms of philosophy, this is an aspect of aesthetics, but most importantly is an aspect of literary theory. Literary theory covers the nature of how we read and interpret text and what methods we use for literary analysis. While it may be called literary theory, this can be applied to more than just writing. Analysis of writing extends to the analysis of art, as these are all mediums upon which we communicate concepts and ideas. The many schools of literary theory are distinguished from one another by not only how to interpret a text, but also by how meaning is produced in the text in relation to its author, audience, and context. Certain theories, like formalism and new criticism, state a single objective correct meaning and divorce it from the author and historical context. Other theories, such as reader response theory and post-structuralism, emphasize the capacity for a multitude of different interpretations and meanings that can be derived from a text. We are meant to interpret this story of destroying the mind control facility for what he intended, a story about breaking free from the shackles of control and making your own choices. The meaning upon which you derive this from comes from the author. This method of interpretation is known as authorial intentionalism. We must constrain our understanding of a piece by what the author intended to come across. The author in this case is the ultimate authority over the meaning of a text and provides it with a single intention. This is what the narrator represents. Not only just the author of the story, but he is also the voice of authorial intentionalism in the game. However, to say the Stanley Parable supports the idea of authorial intentionality is completely wrong. After all, it is a fundamental part of the game that you undermine the author and completely flip his story upside down. With this in mind, let us explore an influential essay in the field of literary criticism. The Death of the Author is an essay written by Roland Barthes, published in 1967. This essay emphasizes that a text's interpretation should not be constrained by the author. Often, when death of the author is brought up, there is a predominant focus on the author and what the author applies to the art, often within the context of the artist's moral actions reflection onto their art. However, the intent of Death of the Author was never to consider splitting the art from the author for the sake of moral righteousness. Rather, it focuses on the finality and restrictions that are brought upon an art piece when the author and the author's intentions and character become the focus of an art. To quote from the essay, "To give a text an author is to impose a limit on the text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing." Death of the Author points out that the author is only the vehicle upon which the contents of the writing are brought into the world. It is in fact the reader who pieces together a story from the vocabulary and concepts used. The reader is without history, biography, psychology. He is simply that someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. Perhaps one could view the idea that the Stanley Parable argues for the death of the author, yet this is ironic as the author is quite literally alive within the game. He is alive and reacting to the audience, be it the players themselves or the players and their reviews of the game.
The narrator is obnoxious and unfunny, with his humor and dialogue proving to be more irritating than entertaining. Unfunny? I'm not trying to be funny. I'm trying to make a serious work of art.
The author is not dead, and this fact plays a major role. It is through the fact that the author lives and emphasizes his authorial intent that creates the art in a sort of ironic, self-referential way. Barthes ends off the essay with this: "We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." The ending in which this is most emphasized in is the skip ending. In this ending, the narrator is disturbed by the bad reviews on the original Stanley Parable, and thus decides to add a skip button like someone asked, and tests it out. However, with each skip, the time paused increases and the narrator is left alone in silence during this time. The button will be pressed until the narrator seemingly ceases to exist, and the memory zone where you once were is nothing but sand. And you are alone, wandering the desert without anyone or anything. You could view the skip ending as such, that once the author is dead, we are left free to roam the world. This specific ending is given a conclusion in the epilogue after finding all the figurines and starting menu cutscenes. Stanley walks upon the desert sands where the beautiful forest once laid. There is nothing here for Stanley. The player wanders the lands, traversing through sandstorms and watching the night sky. Then, you find your way back to the memory zone, upon which you find the remnants of the narrator's plans and the last of the reviews all laid around. The buttons that say your name, the Stanley figurines, they all lay here in the ground. Yet, you find your way back to the office and reach a computer and meet the menu person once again. And here, you are given an opportunity. You are given the opportunity to forgo the legacy of the Stanley Parable, forgo it all. Embrace its absurdity and let it run on and on until it can no longer move. That is what the menu person states, to keep making sequels of the game, even if it's bad, even if it's ruined. Why ruin the fun? This could be interpreted as the true meaning of the game, this emphasis on embracing the ridiculousness and absurdity of the game, and yet perhaps it doesn't. Isn't that the point of the game? The ending of the Ultra Deluxe Edition considers disregarding the artist, who is so wrought in his desire to satisfy the audience. It is the reader and their own experiences who can live on. In fact, this emphasis on the reader could say that it does not argue for the death of the author, nor does it argue for authorial intent. It decidedly takes a different approach. Let art live and let it die. Let it be experienced, and perhaps let the joy of playing the game keep going until you get sick of it. Let the love of the game kill you from inside out. This focus on experience, this focus on playing as the audience, can be attributed to a different literary theory. Reader response theory focuses on what the reader can bring to a text upon interpretation. Art can only be given meaning and an interpretation when read. The reader is an active member in creating meaning and curating the writing. The reader pieces it all together, and therefore, there is no ultimate meaning, for every reader is different. This is particularly interesting in the context of the Stanley Parable as a video game. It is inherently an interactive medium, and this interactiveness provides each player a different experience when playing. As the Stanley Parable does not follow a linear plotline, every player gets to explore the several endings to the game at their own pace, at different orders, and can arrive to different conclusions and understandings, not just from the unique playthrough, but from their own experiences that are brought to the table. In a sense, the reader is the art, as it is the experience of playing the Stanley Parable that art is produced. Without the player, the Stanley Parable could only exist as a concept, in which case the meaning, and its sort of ironic non-meaning, is lost without experience and without the player.
Hi there. Thank you very much for playing The Beginner's Guide. My name is Davey Reedon. I wrote The Stanley Parable, and while that game tells a pretty absurd story, today I'm going to tell you about a series of events that happened between 2008 and 2011. We're going to look at the games made by a friend of mine named Coda.
The Beginner's Guide is a game that explores a catalog of games guided by the narrator, Davey Wreden, who is the developer of the Stanley Parable. As we walk through these games, we learn of Davey's relation to Coda, the developer of these small games, as well as what he thinks of these games. He brings his own interpretations of the games, and by extension his own interpretation of his friend, Coda. There are several important questions brought up through the Beginner's Guide about art, the intended audience, and the interpretation of the artist, much like the Stanley Parable, but in a much different type of view and different topics. The Stanley Parable exists in a meta of a meta state, very self-aware. It is personal yet detached, as the narrator only exists for a story, and the Stanley Parable only exists as a platform for the story to come across. The Beginner's Guide looks at this from a meta state, yes, but rather than being aware of its own medium and the absurdity of choice in writing and the reader and the author, it is instead self-aware of who made the game. The Beginner's Guide starts to take a biographical perspective, straying from the focus on sole authorial intent and leaning a bit more on traditional literary criticism. Let's explore traditional literary criticism. Traditional literary criticism follows the idea of applying historical, geographical, and biographical aspects of an author to determine the intention of the author, and in turn the intention of the art. This is how it has been taught in your typical high school English class. Davey Wreden wrote this game, narrates this game, and plays a role in this game as himself, and in addition, speaks to the player and speaks about his friend. His friend, Coda, made all these small games and shared them with a select few, with one of those being Davey. Davey and Coda are both video game developers, and this plays a role in the Beginner's Guide as Davey points out Coda's mental state and the relationship at the point in time that the games we explore are made. He notes the mechanical choices made in the games, which is really fascinating to explore as a video game medium. The experience plays a fundamental role in the meaning that Davey derives from it. From the very first chapter, Whisper, the game begins with the player equipped with a gun, but note the fact that the gun carries limited ammunition. The gun cannot be reloaded, and he notes it as likely intentional, but he knows not why. At the very end of Whisper, you enter a beam to sacrifice yourself for others. At first, he shows what he assumes was the intended ending, showing yourself dead on the ground. Then, he shows what actually normally happens, which he assumes to be a glitch, but says it seems to provide a nuance to the meaning of the game. Backwards disables forward movement within the game, which can only be felt while playing the game. While one could observe gameplay, the personal experience of each player as they interact and come to terms with their new limitations applies a personal meaning to the game. Stairs is another excellent example of limiting the player's movement to provide nuance or meaning. As you ascend the stairs, your speed slows as you end up going in a crawl. Davey bypasses this slowness for the sake of time, and once you reach the top, you find little concepts for games. In fact, for both stairs and backwards, this is the main nuance of the concept being presented. These little games are short, simple, yet effective thought experiments, as Davey likes to point out. Davey also notes what is seen and what isn't seen in the game. He considers what Coda might have been thinking, why he hid this labyrinth in one game, and the door puzzle in all others that require you to lock yourself in order to find yourself on the other side. And in order to see what is not meant to be seen, Davey breaks the game, configuring aspects of it to show the labyrinth, or show what he assumes was the intended ending. However, as we pass through from game to game, we reach the final game that Coda has made. This game was specifically addressed to Davey, made only for his eyes. In this final game, we learn how Davey is significantly more biased than we previously thought. He notes that he changed some games of Coda, adding an ending to Home when originally it just went on and on. He's an unreliable narrator, as we learn that the lampposts that Coda fixates on were in fact added on Davey's part. How much more has Davey changed these games? And how much of it was his own interpretation that he skewed upon it? We learn how betrayed Coda feels about this, and he cuts off contact with Davey completely. Davey is only a player. He is not the original artist who produced the work. He has brought his own interpretations on the work as a player. Specifically, interpretations on who the artist is. This is something that the death of the author does not explore, but is certainly an aspect of assigning an author to an art that creates such an issue. Davey is creating an identity from the games he plays. He is constructing this concept of Coda from the substance of the art he plays. After all, art imitates life, doesn't it? But we can see how this goes far beyond a safe point. Davy intrudes on Coda's privacy, sharing these games, believing that these games are a cry for help, that only he can really help Coda. He believes that Coda's games that emphasize the frustration of lacking fulfillment from making game after game means that Coda needs validation. But we find out that Coda never wanted Davy's help. Davy interpreted the games for what they were to Coda, and not for what they were themselves. In fact, we learn that the person who is struggling with something is not Coda, it is Davy. Davy has been projecting his own issues, hoping that if he could find a solution for Coda, he could find a solution for himself. He put so much emphasis on the author that it ruined more than just the art he was experiencing, but his relationship to his friend. The Beginner's Guide acts as almost a cautionary tale about attaching the art too closely to the artist. Because, after all, whether or not we're talking about the author, or the reader, or the art itself, we are all still human. Writing and art are fundamentally human things, modes of communication in which we express ideas and concepts that we want others to understand. Art cannot exist without an author, but it also cannot exist without a reader.